All right. So I'm Jasleen Coley. I direct the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA School of Law. And before I begin, I just want to take a moment to thank all of the panelists who've come out here today. I know that since the election, a lot of us have felt that we've been having to work at 150% of our capacity. So I just want to say how much I appreciate it. Just the other week, I was speaking to a friend who does work on voter engagement and Islamophobia, and she was speaking about how she's been constantly asked to do talks, and she had to do a talk on self-care coming up, and she said, you know, if I were really engaged in self-care, I would have said no to this talk. So I just want to thank all of the panelists who are here for maybe not engaging in the self-care that they should and saying yes to these talks. But I hope that it's also really inspired and moved all of you as much as it has for all of us. And also I want to thank all of you in the audience who I know are also in the same situation of working at 150% of your capacity. I know that so many of you are deeply engaged in the issues facing us. We have students, scholars, advocates, activists in this audience, and I just really want to thank you for your presence as well. And I'd also like to give a round of applause to our Critical Race Studies faculty co-directors, Professor Cheryl Harris and Noah Zatz, who somewhere around here, are fearless leaders. If you know them, you obviously know how deeply committed they are to the CRS program, how committed they are to their students, how committed they are to their communities, and how committed they are to social justice, activism, scholarship, and advocacy. So we really just appreciate how much time and energy you both have worked on this, when I know both time and energy are at a premium right now. So thank you both. Also, thank you to Professor Sherrod Thaxton. Not sure where he is, but thank you, who was actually on sabbatical, but somehow accidentally volunteered himself onto our Symposium committee and was really critical in conceptualizing this program. So thank you. And I'd also like to thank our incredible staff. I know you've probably seen out front Jessica, Emily, and Brenda, and we are so, so fortunate to have their enthusiasm, their energy, and their professionalism that they bring to their work and to this program. And lastly, I just want to thank all of the CRS students and the faculty. So many of the students volunteered here today and took their time to help make this program a success. And the faculty, of course, have always supported programming of this nature. And I just want to thank you all for your time and just say what an honor and privilege it is to be part of a program with students and faculty who are just so brilliant, so passionate, so dedicated, and really just plain hilarious. The revolution must have laughter and joy, and you all bring a lot of that, both of those, in abundance, so thank you. So with that, I'd like to turn to our last panel of the day, Race and Resistance, Social Movements in the Post-Trump Era. I recently saw the documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, about James Baldwin. Have folks seen that? Who's seen that? All right, for the rest of you, that's your self-care assignment for the weekend. Go and see it. So anyway, I was reminded of one of my favorite Baldwin quotes. He writes, "American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it." And I think about this during this very, very terrible time. And as Baldwin says, probably even more terrible than anything anyone has said about it, including our many panelists who have talked about the various ways in which it is terrible. But at the same time, this moment has also given rise to something really beautiful, that of widespread, deep, powerful, diverse, beautiful resistance. But by no means do I want to suggest that this resistance is something new, which is one of the critiques of how the resistance movement has been sometimes framed by the media. And in fact, we've seen the birth of some of the most exciting and innovative social movements that have developed in the past few years that we've seen in quite some time, including Black Lives Matter, the Dreamers, the Dream Act students, those in Standing Rock, and the No Doppel movement. And we know that this struggle isn't new. Attacks on communities of color did not begin with Trump, nor are they going to end with Trump. We see and have seen communities and families torn apart by deportations. We see and have seen the destruction caused by state violence, mass incarceration, and the taking of Black lives. We see and have seen brutality against trans people, the destruction of the earth, lack of clean water, and the taking of sacred lands. So these are not new. We know that the project of nation building is bloody, and our history has so much blood on its hands. So none of this is new for people of color, for women, for LGBT communities, and other marginalized peoples. But at the same time, I don't want us to underestimate the very real threats that this moment also brings. And in thinking about this moment, I keep coming back to that SNL skit right after the election with Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock, when they're at the election viewing party and everyone's pretty confident that Hillary has this locked down, except for Dave Chappelle's character, who is the only one who seems aware of the history of embedded racism that this country is built on, and doesn't actually underestimate the country's deep investment in whiteness. At one moment, one of the white men in the, at the party, when he realizes that Trump is actually going to win, says, "Oh my God, this is the most horrible thing that's ever happened to this country." And Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock just look at each other like, actually. So I feel like I've been kind of seesawing between these two emotions since the election about, oh my God, what the fuck? On the one hand, to the other hand of like, well, this was kind of the inevitable result of a system built on oppression, and we knew this type of thing was like, well, it could happen. So I keep going back and forth between these two. And so I'm curious about this moment of political uncertainty and the social upheaval that we're finding ourselves in. We've been seeing the formulation of new political configurations, and I'm curious in what ways social movements, both those that have existed prior to and those born since the election, are imagining themselves and reimagining themselves. And I'm curious if this is a new moment that we're finding ourselves in, or if this is just a continuation of long existing structures of power and oppression. So for that, I'd like to turn to our panelists who are with us here today. All are activists and advocates for social justice, and our panel is going to follow a little bit of a different structure. I'm going to ask a question. They're going to give brief answers and ask a couple more questions. So their responses will be briefer than we've seen, but there will be multiple questions. So to start off, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. Please let us know the pronouns you'd like to use. And tell us about the work you're doing and how your priorities and strategies have and have not shifted before and after the election. I'm curious where you see the continuities and where you see the convergencies and where you see the disruptions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Amina Mirza-Kazi, who is Executive Director of the National Lawyers Guild here in Los Angeles.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Jocelyn, for those inspiring comments and the great framing of our discussion. As she said, I'm the ED of the National Lawyers Guild Los Angeles. I see around the room there are several guild members here as well, and we also have a very strong and robust student chapter here, which Karen up front is very involved with at the UCLA Law School. The Guild has been around for about 80 years, and we've joined in with every struggle in the movement since the rise of the labor movement. I myself also come from a background of working within the civil rights arena with the Muslim American community. I used to work at the Council on American Islamic Relations for several years. So I've also been working on combating the terrorism lens that our community has been looked at through, and also the widespread surveillance of the American Muslim communities. My own journey to this issue and here today is one of constant education. So I am here on this panel, but I'm also here learning as well from my co-panelists and from all of you. One of the things that underrides much of what the Guild does is what we call movement lawyering, where we do believe in litigation, we do believe in casework, but we do believe that much of our role as lawyers is to support the movement. We believe that change is movement-led, led by movement groups. So we don't necessarily, while we do organize as lawyers, legal workers, and law students, and affinity activists, we also do believe that our role is to support what's going on in the ground, to protect the rights to free speech, and to really support where movements groups are taking us. And so one of the things that is said is that we don't fight for the cause, we fight with the people. Does that make sense? And that's a huge distinction of how we approach our lawyering and how we approach this. And so as attorneys, it is tough for us to come to this work for anyone, because if you're invested in this work, you also have to be invested in dismantling the structures of privilege and race that often got us to where we are. And so it is difficult for some to accept that, but that's part of what we like to push for and educate, that we're in this to win it. And so one of the things that has changed since the election is just this mass outpouring. We've seen it in the streets, we've seen it all of our nonprofits and people wanting to volunteer, and we honor that because we recognize that everyone has different entry points to the movement. As Jocelyn said, like, much of this has been going on for decades and longer, but some people are just coming to it. And so we honor the different entry points that people have. We honor the radicalization points, like people hitting something or some realization and realizing, wow, we got to take this to the next level. And one of the things that has shifted that I've seen after the election is how commonplace it is to be in a gathering like this and be publicly discussing civil disobedience strategies. Right? Like, we got post-Trump, like some of us were organizing, we're like, we've got to take this to the next level, right? And then we get out there in the streets and the people are taking it to the next level. Yep. We don't even have to organize them. And it's fantastic to see it. But one of the things we have to ask ourselves is how many people are really committed to systemic change and how many people are just committed to toning down the rhetoric? Because as we've seen already, the Trump administration is starting to throw us bones, right? Like, all right, you really want DACA? Well, here's DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals. You really want this? Well, here's this. But really, we're facing an opportunity, and this is where we get into our intersectional sanctuary city movement, which I'll get into later, or maybe some of the co-panelists can address as well, is that we're not just resisting, we're building a vision. We're building a future for ourselves in which we've envisioned that these structures of control and power and privilege are dismantled, and we're in it to win it. We're not just in it to tone down the rhetoric. We're not in it to get us back to the status quo. We're utilizing this opportunity and utilizing radical tactics to take us to that level. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And next we have Ignacio Rodriguez. Actually, I think we got mixed up in order, but that's fine. Okay.
Oh, that's fine.
Ignacio.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ignacio Rodriguez. My preferred gender pronouns are she and her. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm myself an alum from UCLA, and I did the specialization of critical race studies. I'm proud of it. So thank you so much for having me here. So I work at the National Immigration Law Center. I'm the immigration policy advocate there. And what I do is I oversee the work that's done around access to status. For the past few years, given the political context, it's been mostly focused on the implementation of DACA and the benefits that are available to those who have DACA, such as professional license and also access to education. It was envisioned that my role would also deal with the implementation of DAPA and expanded DACA, but due to a held up at the courts, that is not possible. But still, my work has significantly changed after the election and continues to change, I would say. And the organization as a whole has been changing as well. We've engaged a lot more in defensive work, defensive strategies, right? Planning for all possible scenarios. There has been, as you know, executive orders signed by the president, but there's also been leaked drafts, confirmed and unconfirmed, that has also created a lot of panic. And so planning for those possible executive orders to be signed is part of the task that we have now. There's also been a lot more work around enforcement, a lot more work around raids response, and then litigation as well, seeing if there's a way to be able to combat some of these attacks through the court systems, which for us right now seem to be one of the more neutral spaces. And so the work has really changed. And at the same time, I think as an organization, we're being really challenged to think through intersectionality and to be much more vocal. We've had an intersectionality lens. We have work groups within the organization that think through LGBTQ issues and racial issues. We, for example, have modified our employee handbook to be able to reflect and be more intentional of keeping in mind diverse groups within our organization. But I feel now more than ever, we've been challenged to make sure that in everything that we do and everything that we say, we have the intersectionality lens in mind. And that's been very hard because there's this good immigrant versus bad immigrant rhetoric that we found that it's pretty hard to get our partners sometimes to move away from. So more concretely, when I was an undocumented college student organizing around the DREAM Act, I would say things like, I'm not a criminal, we're not criminals, we came here through no fault of our own, our parents brought us here, we were young, not knowing that what I was essentially doing was criminalizing my parent. And then also I was throwing under the bus our brothers and sisters who may have had interactions with the law, most likely because of the complexion of their skin, or also, let's say, due to the geographic area where they live, where law enforcement was more present. And we didn't know this at the time. And we said these things, and those things have real consequences. And unfortunately, I still continue to see other people using that rhetoric. And so as NILC, we try to tell our partners and teach our partners why that's problematic. So more concretely, there have been raids where DACA recipients have been picked up as collateral arrests. So ICE goes in and they detain a parent or a relative of theirs that's in the household and then start interrogating a DACA recipient and take them into custody. Well, some of the reports that you see online through the media or through social media really focus more on how can this DACA recipient have gotten picked up, not really asking the question, well, why was ICE there in the first place? Why were they looking for that person's parent or that person's family member? So I feel like that's a continuing challenge, and now more than ever, we really have to be cognizant of that and challenge it every time we see it. Thank you.
And next, we'll hear from Zac Muhammad.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. My name is Zac Muhammad, and I use he, him, his for my gender pronouns, and I work for Black Alliance for Just Immigration. I am the LA organizer, and it's kind of funny. Last year, we just celebrated our 10th anniversary, and as a nonprofit, once you hit the double digits, you're no longer like a baby organization. And Black Alliance for Just Immigration does racial and immigrant justice work with the African diaspora, so folks who come out of Africa, folks who are Afro-Latinx, and Latinx is a gender-neutral term for Latino, Latina, and the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. And we do a lot of issue education, advocacy, leadership development, and alliance building, basically working with a lot of our partners because this is not a single issue. It's not going to only affect the Black African American community, and a lot of the white supremacy and the colonialism and all of these systems really impact a lot of different communities. And something that we have been noticing is that a lot of stuff hasn't really changed. On January 19th, when Obama was still in presidency, there was still a lot of deportation, even before Clinton's era, George Bush, the first one, Reagan. We've known that deportations has been a thing for the US. And why Baji is so looking into the immigration issue that we have and the deportation machine that we have is specifically it affects a lot of Black migrants. And recently with a lot of the executive orders, the first one, basically the wall of how it is militarizing our police to become able to push a lot of communities, break families apart, and basically of how a lot of people are coming through the border. Last year, there was a report of 7,000 Haitians, Africans, Asian Pacific Islanders. So many different communities are coming through the border, and putting a lot of these detention centers along the border is also making it so that we are making immigration or these communities look like they are evil or bad. And the next one is really much the Muslim ban of how it affects three countries in Africa: Libya, Sudan, and Somalia. And I come from Somalia. I was born there. My family had to flee due to a civil war, and we sought refuge in Kenya. And even as a young child, I know what a refugee goes through. I know what my mom went through, specifically living on bare minimum of having to provide for not only her family but other community members, because it was really a village, and it was the community coming together, working together. And a lot of Muslims are banned. Specifically, this executive order is so preponderous, basically, that I'm surprised that it actually got through, and it gives this rhetoric that all Muslim people are evil people or terrorists, and how we have this divide and conquer within the U.S. And the last one is the enhanced public safety, the executive order, basically, which was more so around sanctuary, of how convicting immigrants and making immigrants who are convicted, and the racial profiling that goes along with this executive order, as a lot of Black people, African people are racially profiled day in and day out. And this is a target to a lot of our members and a lot of our communities. And we've been having a lot of hysteria within our community as well, too. A lot of miscommunication, a lot of wrong information being shared out. So it's hard to know actually if there's a ICE raid or a deportations checkpoint within a specific area. And Baji is really trying to make sure that we are accurate in our information. We are giving it in a specific time base where the community can really actually mobilize and secure our families, secure our people, and protect our communities. And I'm going to stop there.
And next we have Carmina Ocampo, who is the staff attorney and immigrants' rights program strategist at Lambda Legal.
Hi, my name is Carmina, and I'm an attorney at Lambda Legal, which is the oldest and largest legal organization that fights for the civil rights of LGBT people and people living with HIV through litigation, public policy advocacy, and community outreach. And I'm also a very proud graduate of UCLA Law School and the Critical Race Studies program. So I first want to start out reading the names of transgender women of color that were murdered, just because it's important to say their names, say her name, as we say. Marsha Caldwell, Jamie Lee Wounded Arrow, Jojo Stryker, Jacqueris Holland, KK Collier, China Doll Dupree, Ciara McElveen. And just three transgender women of color, 3 Black women were just murdered in the past week in Louisiana, and 2 within 48 hours. And so 2017, there have already been 7 transgender women of color murdered. And 2016 was the deadliest year for transgender women, and mostly transgender women of color. And the year before that was the deadliest year, and this is 2017. So I start with this, just because there's a room full of really smart people here to just collectively ask, what actions are we taking to keep transgender people safe? And I want to also read a quote by Chris Hayashi, who is the executive director of the Transgender Law Center in Oakland, and he is an Asian American transgender man. And he said, "We know that as transgender people, as non-binary people, as people of color, our communities were already in crisis before Trump took office. Crisis is not new. Our communities have always fought back. We have a legacy of incredible leadership from Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, and Miss Major. We know how to fight, we know how to keep each other safe, and we know how to build community." So I thought that quote was incredibly inspiring, and I'll just talk generally about how the kind of landscape has changed for LGBT civil rights in the Trump era, and kind of how legal organizations and activists have had to respond. You know, first, it's important to point out that LGBT people, especially transgender people, lack explicit federal protections against discrimination in employment, public accommodations. housing, and education. And that's really important because transgender people continue to be discriminated against in all aspects of society. And now in this era, it would be impossible, while it seemed likely that we could have pushed for something like that before, that will not be likely now at all as even a strategy we can pursue with Congress. There's also going to be a continuation of a horrible upsurge of homophobic and anti-transgender laws that are introduced in states across the country. And this didn't just start now. Right after, in the year after Obergefell v. Hodges, that made marriage equality the law of the land, the important Supreme Court decision, there were over 200 anti-LGBT and bills introduced in state legislatures, and 50 of those were specifically targeting transgender people. And the most heinous one that we saw was, of course, North Carolina's HB2, and that was designed to strip localities from expanding protections for LGBT people. And that went even further, and it banned transgender people from being able to use bathrooms and locker facilities that corresponded or that matched who they are and corresponded to their gender identity. And that was really that law was really about saying transgender people don't have the right to exist in public space. So we're going to see more laws like that. Just today, just this week, a horrible law was introduced in Arkansas that would make it impossible for transgender people to change their birth certificates. And there have been over oh my God, in 1 minute. I'm gonna move on. In education, you've heard that the Trump administration rescinded the Obama administration's guidance to school districts that said that clarified that transgender students are protected under Title IX and can't be discriminated against in schools. Well, that Trump administration rescinded that, and that didn't change the law, that didn't change Title IX, but it will have a horrible and harmful impact on transgender students because it creates confusion across the country, and bad acting school districts now might take advantage of that and rescind their inclusive policies. Also, students needed that guidance. Parents needed that guidance. Administrators needed that guidance to be able to advocate for transgender youth and to be able to say that because of this guidance, we're allowed to do this when they were afraid to do that before. So it opens up just a venue for bullying. And now, as legal organizations, we have to devote more resources to oh my God, I'm over time, to suing school districts. I just want to mention too, if Affordable Health Care Act is repealed, that will mean, that meant that people living with HIV could get affordable health insurance. They won't be able to do that anymore. The Affordable Health Care Act also said that transgender people couldn't be discriminated against in receiving care. So that will affect transgender people and people living with HIV. And finally, just under the Trump administration, undocumented LGBT immigrants and transgender people were deported and put in detention. And as advocates, we were really able to still put pressure on DHS and try to say that transgender people should be released from detention because they suffer abuse, sexual assault, are put in solitary confinement, are denied medically necessary care in immigration detention. But now, even we used to have a federal working group where we could try and push for that and send letters to the Obama administration. We're disbanding because there's just no point of that in this era. So things really have changed. And I have to say one last thing, I know over time, we have to mention there is individually perpetrated violence against transgender people. So there's state violence that we've talked about a lot, but individually perpetrated violence. So in the media, if people are talking about transgender people, transgender women being predators, preying on innocent women, innocent white women, and these images are coming up, that is dehumanizing language, and that legitimizes violence. So that's what we're dealing with.
And lastly, we have Melanie Ozzie, who is Acting Assistant Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at UC Riverside.
I'm going to time myself, and hopefully I don't go over time. I'm not going to give my full kind of Navajo version of my introduction because it takes 5 minutes, so I'm just going to go directly into describing the work that I do. I'm also a University of California President's postdoctoral fellow in the Gender Studies Department here at UCLA for this year, in addition to being at UCR in the Gender and Sexuality Studies Department, which I'll be starting my tenure track line there next year in the fall quarter. I work at the intersection of American Indian studies, feminist and queer studies, as well as history. I'm a self-hating historian because anybody who knows anything about the way that history, especially scholarly history, is written about Native people still leaves a lot to be desired in terms of its political commitments to decolonization and anti-colonial work and Indigenous voices in general. There's a really profound overlap between the organizing work that I do and the intellectual work that I do. And in terms of my organizing work, I co-founded an organization called the Red Nation in Albuquerque. I just finished my PhD at the University of New Mexico. So much of the work that I've done has been in the American Southwest, and since I'm also Navajo, it's my homeland. And so it just makes sense that we were doing organizing work, and all of my intellectual work also comes out of that sort of geopolitical space. And the Red Nation is not a nonprofit. We're a pure volunteer-based group. We're Native-led. We're led by women, LGBTQ, youth, and poor, who are actually the silent majority in a great deal of not just social justice organizing, but also, even surprisingly, organizing that happens on Native issues. And so we co-founded this group 3 years ago, and we're specifically feminist, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial, and then also Native-led. And so even though we focus on Indigenous liberation, we have a strong commitment to coalition work. So for example, I have done a lot of Palestine solidarity work. I've been to the West Bank. I've been engaging in that work for the last 5 or 6 years. We were very involved in the No DAPL movement, but increasingly we have been concentrating on what we call border town violence. Border towns are these sort of white-dominated settlements that ring Indian reservations, especially reservations that have large land bases. And the particular way that settler colonialism and white supremacy and sort of patriarchal violence manifest in those spaces really reflects US nationalism writ large, but with a very anti-Indian, using Elizabeth Cookland's term, a very anti-Indian character to it. And so we've been doing a lot of intellectual work around border town violence. What is that? But also organizing against it in those spaces. And an important part of that work is addressing police violence against Native people, which I think is something that people are thinking about more. You know, Black Lives Matter has brought up the issue of police brutality. I'm going to hope to touch on this a bit more in the second or the third question. In ways that intersect really profoundly with how Native people are taking up our movement and are organizing around combating police brutality against Native folks. I also do work on water, on sort of understanding water and not just land in terms of colonial dispossession of Native people. So that's just a bit of my background and my organizing with the Red Nation. The way that things have changed, it's hard to describe. The way that things have changed since Trump took office a little over a month ago is that I'm going to talk specifically about my organizing work, is that the Red Nation has actually started to engage in much more broad-based anti-fascist work. And so we're working with different organizations. We're studying. We have study groups every week where we're reading more broadly, not just in indigenous, intellectual, and radical traditions, which is something that we already do in the Red Nation, but really engaging much more profoundly with socialist and anarchist histories as well as those traditions, because I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but mainstream media has been taking up the questions of socialism and anarchism. You saw that, did anybody see that Rolling Stone piece on anarchists fighting with, is it the YPK? I always get those acronyms wrong. The Kurdish military against ISIS in Syria. And there are massive conversations happening about sort of violence within the movement and how Antifa and sort of these anarchist tendencies, Anonymous is still around, you know, are showing up at Milo Yiannopoulos protests. We organized the one that happened actually at the University of New Mexico when he came a month ago. And so the idea or the consciousness around socialist traditions and anarchist traditions, I think has bubbled up because of the Trump administration. And so we're trying to think much more broadly and much more critically about how an anti-colonial, indigenous-led sort of understanding and engagement with anarchism and socialism helps to galvanize the left much more broadly. Because we also see there's a war going on. The right is very empowered, a very extreme form of right-wing racism, of course, that's consolidating in white nationalism. And we take very seriously the fact that those of us on the left, myself included, I've spent most of my political and organizing career in the last decade kind of focusing on the left and critiquing things within the left. And I didn't really take the right that seriously, to be honest with you. And I'm taking it much more seriously, trying to understand the nuances of the right. And so we were incorporating that work into the Red Nation. And I'll just stop there since I'm out of time.
Thank you. All right. So next, I'd like for you all to build on what you've just spoken about, and help us think about how we move forward. Since this is our last panel, I really want to think about where do we go from here? What do we feel that social movements need in order to be successful? And you can take some time to respond to one another. And I'm also interested in a few areas here. For the lawyers on the panel, I'm interested in what you think the role of lawyers in the legal community is going to be in creating social change in this environment. How do lawyers function within social movements? And also, what legal strategies do we need to deploy vis-a-vis the administration's posturing with the judiciary? For the organizers, I'm curious about how you think we conceptualize effective and inclusive resistance. It's really exciting right now because there's been a lot of calls for the centering of an intersectional analysis in our approaches to social justice, and also the centering of the most marginalized and vulnerable populations. But at the same time, we see this backlash against identity politics and the perceived divisiveness of this type of approach. And lastly, for everyone, given the influx of new activists into the movement, how do we keep momentum? How do we build upon these movements? How do we create cross-cultural collaborations? And how do we be allies to other movements? So this one I'm going to leave open as far as who would like to start first, unless I want to call on someone.
I'll start. So I touched a little bit upon my thoughts of what lawyers can do at this moment. Does anyone else in here, after listening to these wonderful panelists, just kind of feel a rumbling in your gut right now? Right? And that's what we as lawyers and law students need to recognize. We need to understand that rumbling in our gut as a call to action, a call to get out into the streets and to support the organizers and actually be an organizer in our own right. I think a lot of times what happens to us throughout our legal careers is that we start thinking that we need to do something extra special or extra different, and we kind of lose our humanity and our roots. And so my first suggestion is to go back to our humanity and our roots. I'm actually doing a lot of, I'm an organizer now. I never knew I was an organizer, but the last couple months I've been organizing marches and rallies and actions, and it's been fantastic. I think also I'd like to touch upon, with respect to this question of intersectionality and centering the most impacted groups, is our sanctuary city movement. The sanctuary city movement started as a call for the city of Los Angeles and the county to divest from federal immigration enforcement, to expand Special Order 40, to update it, revise it, to provide universal representation and establish an LA Justice Fund. And as more and more groups came to that cause, and as we started not getting the responses we were expecting from elected officials, we were sitting in a room and saying, how can we keep turning our attention to elected officials who are not giving us what we want? And the natural answer came out as, we get what we want. And so the sanctuary movement has now become a vastly populist movement in which, yes, we are still placing demands in the city and on the county, but for example, on March 18th, there was this mass rally of about 10,000 people in which we declared Los Angeles to be a sanctuary city for all. The people made that move. Yes, it is an aspirational statement, but we realize that we cannot call for the divestment from immigration enforcement and still be okay with localities and local law enforcement still working with federal law enforcement on counterterrorism operations targeting the Muslim community. That we can't do this when Black lives still don't feel safe in the city of Los Angeles. How can we in good faith call it a safe city when all Evangelinos do not feel safe? So that goes back to what I started off with, is that we are envisioning what we want the city to be. We are defining what sanctuary means, and we are working to build that together. A couple other considerations are, how do we mobilize a community that's been facing trauma and is actually living the chilling effect of oppressive government policies? And I think that's seen often when we look at the American Muslim community, which studies show is very civically minded, loves the direction the country, pre-election of course, loves the direction the country has been going when Obama was the drone president. He was the deportation president, and he was the first president that I know of that publicly sanctioned the assassination of an American citizen on foreign soil. But Muslim Americans still were happy with the Obama administration, largely unhappy with the direction of the country. So how do we follow the movement and have it be movement-led when much of the movement is operating from a disempowered state of trauma? So this has led to this sense of dual consciousness where American Muslims love the system, a system that is built against them. And I'm sure other racial groups and identity groups understand that. Where American Muslims have lost their cosmopolitanism and their biting critique of American foreign policy. And that's where we have to understand that if we're to empower the American Muslim community and work with them, we have to understand that it's not just about domestic foreign policy. American Muslim voices need to be able to call out oppression overseas. We need to call it as we see it, and that is the only way our community will feel fully empowered. And that's why the protests at LAX, again, I was one of the co-organizers for those mass actions at LAX, was so telling for so many reasons. Oh, nice. Thank you all for showing up. And, you know, it was just this beautiful outpouring. I mean, we Muslims, we prayed in the airport. Mm-hmm. Put yourself in our shoes. After 15, 16 years, we prayed in the airport in congregation. That's a big deal. We were reclaiming a space of historical trauma for our community, something that we have not been able to do for the past 15 years. Mm-hmm. And that is how we mobilize and listen to communities that are facing ongoing trauma, is we help create literally safe circles, places of safety, listen to what their rituals are, what makes them feel empowered, and help uplift those voices. And that's how lawyers and organizers and others can really step up in this moment.
Who'd like to go next?
I can go next, but it's very hard to follow, Mina. So I could only really speak to like the immigrant rights movement and what our next steps are. I kind of see it in three pockets, and so I see it as a litigation, a policy, and a communication strategy. So litigation-wise, I mean, we've seen states like Washington and New York file lawsuits against Trump. NILC is part of the case that's challenging the Muslim travel ban, which Zac referred to earlier. So we've been seeing movements in the courts trying to stop any attack that Trump puts forward. And that's been hopeful because in a situation, as was mentioned before, where like we can't necessarily ask certain federal agencies anymore for protection, it's great to at least know that we have the courts available to be able to provide a more neutralized system of checks and balances. So we do see a lot more litigation moving forward. Policy-wise, there is some talks about what can be done at the federal legislative level, what can be passed to protect certain populations. So some folks are talking about comprehensive immigration reform being on the table. Others are looking for legislation that may protect subgroups, for example, those who currently have DACA. But that is something that is being considered, and it's going to be up for debate, and we're going to have some tough conversations because going back to the idea of intersectionality, there may be, some tensions there. Then policy-wise, though, the one I really want to focus on is all the really great proactive measures that have been happening at the state and local level, which is very encouraging to see. At the local level, for example, there's been a lot of talks about creating sanctuary cities, sanctuary schools. When the inauguration, actually before the inauguration, when the election night happened, the next day we received so many calls, and most of the calls came from educators that were concerned about what they can do for students. And that was an interesting thing for me to see, because I remember being in school and wanting to talk about immigration and what can be done to support undocumented and AB 540 college students. And some teachers were like, what? I don't understand. Why don't you have a social security number? And a lot of them thinking, oh, this is too political. We shouldn't get involved. But here, the majority of the people that contacted our offices classes were folks who were educators and were really concerned about their students, and for them it was a no-brainer. What can we do? And we also have seen, whereas before it was really hard to convince people to even consider becoming a sanctuary school or city, where now people are not just willing to push for that, but on top of that are willing to also not partake in any type of efforts to help a Muslim registry. So it's saying, for example, that we're gonna not allow ICE to use state and local resources to target immigrants, but it's also saying we're not gonna let the use of state and local resources to feed into and support a Muslim registry. So silver linings under all this chaos, we have seen, a broader support and within our issues. And then lastly, communications. That's another bucket that I want to talk about because it's a mess now. Now, before we used to get our news from the White House statements that were to be made. Some agencies would be kind enough to give us a heads up when a major announcement would come down the line. But now we're checking news media outlets, we're checking Twitter accounts. It's, and rumors spread like wildfire. So we're really focusing on making sure that we project like accurate information, right? And making sure that any kind of myth that's debunked is actually, like, people understand what's going on and not be subject to the paranoia and the rumors that are spreading. And then also another part of communications, which I really am happy to see, is that it's given a platform for immigrants, people directly affected, to actually be able to voice their own concerns and to voice their own stories, which is really beautiful to see. So if you go to the Undocumedia social media pages or their website, or if you go to United We Dream, you can hear directly like how people are affected by all these issues, and it's them telling their story. So you don't need a lawyer, you don't need a NILC, you don't need anyone to tell your story for you. They are doing it, and they're telling you what they want when they want to. So that's been really encouraging to see, but of course, there's still a lot more work we have to do. There's a lot more coalition building that needs to happen, and I look forward to working with all of you, those of you in the room too, to get that done.
Mentioned earlier, someone that works at a legal organization, legal orgs are going to be filing lawsuits to respond to any more, executive orders that come out and fighting it back against really horrible state bills. But, it's also important for us as lawyers to just support the work of grassroots organizations and social movements and just mobilizations that are going on. And, we talk so much about intersectionality, and just in thinking about the work that, I do is working on LGBT rights is, just like even when we talk about transgender women of color being murdered, to connect that to South Asian, to like the South Asian man in Kansas who was murdered, and connect the dots about in talking about these things. And even when we talk about transgender students, frequently the images of transgender students who are fighting for their rights in the media are white transgender students. So we have to really take time and make sure that we're talking about transgender youth of color, and also about how transgender youth of color are like other Black children and youth in schools are being affected by the school to prison pipeline, and how the police presence in schools really impacts and harms transgender youth of color. We also, I just wanted to mention that it's just really inspiring that queer and transgender youth and activists have been leaders in just broader social justice movements, like in the Black Lives Matter movement and in the Not One More movement. So it's not just like there's this LGBT movement, but like LGBT leaders are in these bigger social movements and are leaders in them. So just to remember that and take a cue from that and support that. I do see nonprofits and legal organizations, even though they can be limited, kind of altering their programs. Like the Transgender Law Center just started a immigration legal defense program just in the past month that is meant to give immigration representation to transgender women in detention, and that was in direct response to kind of what's happening with immigration. And I would like to see more just legal organizations, LGBT organizations, which we're starting to do but not enough, is devoting resources to suing prisons, suing detention centers, that when the rights of transgender people are violated. And One example of how and LGBT organizations have tried to support other movements is, LGBT organizations like Lambda Legal, which is my org. We just took measures recently to support the sex workers' rights movement and to call for the decriminalization of sex work. And that's because there's a lot of just activism going around with sex workers trying to fight for decriminalization of sex work. So, what we did was we supported Amnesty International's deeply researched platform that rejects the criminalization of sex work, and we've done a lot to speak out about the harms of the arrests, fines, sentences, criminal records, injuries, and violence that criminalizing sex work generates against LGBT people and many others. And we filed an amicus brief in the courts because there's a case going on right now in the Ninth Circuit that another organization filed to challenge California's prostitution law, and we filed an amicus brief, regardless of what happens to that case, but us in the ACLU filed briefs saying that we support the decriminalization of sex work in California because we don't think criminalizing sex workers promotes public health, which is the argument that the state was making. So that's an example of us being an LGBT organization trying to support the work of another movement in the sex workers' rights movement. So I'll just end it at that. Oh, and I just want to say lawyers can do a lot, actually. There's important activism going on, but lawyers can do a lot. The FAQs that lawyers write and legal organizations write can be helpful to activists. Law professors can write memos that, activists can use, which is what happened with the movement to get DACA passed. The law professors wrote a letter that said this is possible for this executive action to be taken, and that was really powerful. Lawyers can file lawsuits that if strategically to support the movement goals of activists and organizers. Lawyers can help file complaints with government agencies. And, lawyers can also just show up to press conferences. It's important for people who are impacted to be the voice and to be the ones speaking at public events and to testify and at press conferences. But sometimes if it's welcome, a lawyer who can speak to also support that. And frequently, that will be very supportive of the groups that are holding a press conference. So that's it.
You want to go or I can go?
I can go either way. Okay. I'll go next. Here, let me time myself again. This is a really hard question to answer in 5 minutes, but I'm going to do it by way of talking about unity, unity that comes from violence and exposure to violence. I think something that the panel that previous to us was talking about is maybe what has changed about neoliberalism or just liberalism in general in its particular configurations in the era of Trump. And it's same, but different, right? And so I think a lot of us are trying to think about how there's this continuity of sort of the underlying logic of white supremacy that has always structured settler colonialism, capitalism, and racism, which are pillars themselves of US nationalism, but sort of what the character and what's different about it. And I wrote this Facebook post, and again, getting a lot of information from Facebook, as Shannon Speed said, because brilliant things happen on Facebook. About thinking that we might be seeing sort of the death of a particular kind of neoliberalism that we've all been very used to, I would say especially since 9/11, since 2001. And what I meant by that is the form of white nationalism, white supremacy that's arising is a blanket form of violence against racialized subjects, and I'm including, populations that we may not have been thinking ourselves in the left as being subjected to racialized logics that are always upheld through state violence and vigilante violence, of course, settlers and citizens enact this violence against each other. And so the degree and sort of the bare fist fight kind of violence I see coming out of the consolidation of this particular form of white nationalism within sort of centralized US governance in Washington, D.C. is creating opportunities. I mean, this is a really messed up thing to say. I study violence. It's also one of the things that I specialize in. But it allows us to see the relationships that we have across difference in terms of we're racialized in very different ways, right? And this is what intersectionality speaks to. Even though we're racialized in very different ways, the ways that power works and how the violence works on our bodies and in our communities is always related and co-constituted with these other structures of power and other ways that power operates. And so something that's interesting and that's not quite neoliberal anymore is that even though neoliberalism is incredibly violent, that violence was being concealed, right, through logics of economicization and sort of the way that biopolitics was working under neoliberalism. And it's sort of come home to roost and it's laid bare in this really horrible way, but there's also, like I'm saying, this opportunity, I think, for us to work across difference and just to tackle that violence face on. I would much rather have somebody engage in violence to my face than behind my back, to be honest with you. And so this is one of the logics that we use when we're organizing in the Red Nation. And so that provides opportunities for building coalition, which is a form of pragmatic intersectionality in our actual practice of resistance. And also encouraging people to intervene into sort of the siloed off work that happens a lot. I'm sure there are organizers in this room, like the multiple political tendencies and the squabbles we have with each other that really ruin our opportunities to engage in coalition, being able to engage in intervention across those differences that builds us and strengthens us and galvanizes us rather than continues to sort of separate us along all of these different sort of political tendencies and these agendas that we often advance in the movement. I'm also going to say one more thing, something that the Red Nation was already doing and something that has come out of the front lines at Standing Rock is a really militant form of resistance. And I'm seeing a lot of peace policing, I call it peace policing, going on the left. And that's a pejorative way to look at it because these conversations about tactics and about the place of violence within the actual on-the-ground organizing that we're doing, those are important conversations that we need to have. But I would like to encourage people to think about being militant. I'm engaging in intellectual militancy as that being not just, throwing Molotov cocktails through windows, and there's a time and a place for that. Let's be honest. I'm not the riot police here either, right? And there's a time and a place for that, but the way that we engage in militancy can spread far and wide within the academy and within other institutions, but beyond on the streets. And so I really want to encourage people, we're at war with something that has a very intense death drive. It's very in our face. The kind of police violence that was happening against water protectors at Standing Rock, that ain't anything new, but it's at a certain kind of scale and laid bare, I think, in a way that it perhaps wasn't before. And so what we're seeing is groups like Black Lives Matter, Native people standing up at Standing Rock, really revealing the fundamental aspect of that violence to the system of power and to the United States that we currently live under. And we're seeing a very strong response to that. The same level of violence that's being exerted against our communities, the same level of repression against dissent that we're seeing all over the country, happening particularly through state legislatures, is going to increase. And it's matching how much work has actually already been done by communities. I'm just going to talk specifically about Black and Native communities, of revealing and laying bare that brute violence that really upholds a project of US nationalism. And so that being the reality that we're facing, thinking tactically not just about peaceful or NVDA, nonviolent direct action, or civil disobedience, but thinking much more broadly about what those tactics look like and thinking about what militancy is in our work. I have more to say, but I'll stop there.
I think a way to have a effective and inclusive resistance is definitely looking at who is not at the table, who is not here. And that also means not tokenizing people as well too, because a lot of times we're like, oh, you should come to this because you're Black, because you're a Muslim. It's also that we have to make it so that the people are bought into the movement and being able to talk about why this resistance is necessary for themselves and their community. And privilege goes a long way. I myself have cis male privilege, and understanding the privileges a lot of people have, and being able to look at the social changes that are happening and adapting, and being able to understand it, and being able to talk to your fellow community and people who also had the same privilege as you, and being able to understand, not sharing the story, but more so the lessons that you are learning. And then I think a lot of times what happens between identity politics and the backlash is we live in a individual society of how a lot of people are thinking for themselves, oh, this issue matters to me because it affects me and I need to talk about this. And that's perpetuating a lot of the white supremacy and ways of colonialization has affected a lot of communities. Specifically, I can talk about how within the Muslim community of not being able to stand up for LGBTQ, I myself identify as a Muslim person and a queer person. You are saying I do not exist and my life does not matter if you aren't saying that you can't be at the table, or noticing within organizing of specifically if you have strategic wins that affect a certain community of how a lot of those community members leave because now they are privileged with those laws and with those ordinances. And specifically right now, what Baji is really working on is how do we have a platform or a framework that encompasses outside of the sanctuary. Sanctuary does not free a lot of people. We need freedom cities and or liberation of all of our communities, and that really means having a way of looking at safety beyond policing, because you can't have ICE without police, and you can't militarize the police and being able to send them out into nonviolence resistance and ways of people showing civil disobedience of why this system is oppressing them. You need to have a way to invest in humanity, of how we have a lot of defense funds and a lot of our money goes into militaries, but our schools are struggling, our communities are struggling. We have gentrification displacing a lot of people. And we have to acknowledge that political power of understanding the elected officials that we owe dear to, and they are public servants to us. And how do we make sure that we are talking to the right people, and specifically creating some sort of hate-free zone of making it so that the communities are learning of ways to talk about specific issues, and that they are educating their fellow neighborhoods, and not relying on elected officials to make specific laws to protect their community, of how the community has a lot of control and power. And also workers' rights, of how a lot of people are a lot of workers right now are in disarray. Unions are being busted. Union busing is happening, of how we are losing a lot of rights. The Affordable Care Act is going away, or is in the momentum to being moved away. And also I want to talk about all of that. It really encompasses of how we need to have people at the table, of how we are able to talk about the momentum and being able to grasp and understand that the old systems don't work for us. Sanctuary is a great model, but it doesn't work for a lot of communities. And we have to be intersectional of understanding all of these communities are affected this way, and how do we move forward?
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask one last question before I open it up to the audience. And I wanted to end on a question regarding hope. After the election, Junot Diaz wrote this piece that I was really, really struck by on the concept of radical hope. And in it, he wrote that radical hope is hope that is, quote, directed toward a future goodness that transcends the current ability to understand what it is. He says only radical hope could have imagined people like us into existence. And I just love that concept, because I think about what type of radical hope must our ancestors have had. And I want to turn to you and ask, what's fueling your radical hope?
So I can go first. For me, it's two things. One, it's the allies that have shown up to their first protest ever, whether it be the January 21st protest or the protests that happened in LAX and other airports. It's just beautiful to see people that maybe prior to Trump would not have been as engaged, actually paying attention. And so that's been really encouraging to see. And then secondly, those who are directly affected by this issue, the resilience and empowerment that they feel has really been inspiring for me. And more concretely, just like a funny story to share, on February 14th, it was rumored that Trump would be signing an executive order, and it was rumored that it would most likely deal with immigration. I, for weeks after the inauguration, to be completely honest, was on edge. I was in a very dark place. I was very paranoid. I had anger. I would wake up in a terrible mood. So on February 14th, before I went to work, my partner wished me a happy Valentine's Day. And in my head, I was like, we'll see how happy it is. And so then I go to work angry, and I'm like ready for what's to come, ready to fight. And then I check my phone, and I have 2 lovely messages from 2 dear friends of mine who happen to have DACA wishing me a happy Valentine's Day. And it's a small thing, but for me, that's when I had to snap out of it and realize that I can't live in paranoia, I can't live in fear, I can't let that run my life. And those who are directly affected by these issues, those that fear the elimination of DACA as it has real consequences for their own lives, they don't live in fear. They're not letting it stop them from pursuing their dreams and going to work every day. And so I feel like that's something that I find to be really empowering and important to remember, to make sure that I don't live in fear and I don't live in paranoia, and that whatever Trump does decide to do, I'll be ready and prepared to respond to, but I don't have to live in fear of it.
Let's go next.
Yeah, okay. I created a PowerPoint, so just for this last question, can somebody help me? Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay, so I just want to read a quote by Miss Major, who is a Black trans elder and Stonewall icon, formerly incarcerated person. And she said after the election on Facebook, "We've all been knocked down, just don't stay down, get back up and fight. And if you can't get up, then tag someone to jump in and fight in your place. Never give up, never say quit, never say die." She also says, "I'm still fucking here all the time." So what gives me hope is just the incredible intersectional organizing of queer and trans youth that's going on and has been going on. And so I only have it through pictures. So this is a picture of queer Selena, who was protesting Joe Arpaio. And the headlines of the article said, "Queer, Latinx activist bids Joe Arpaio, biddy, biddy, gone, gone." That was the actual headline. Jersey is his name. And I just want to say, what could be more threatening to the white nationalist vision of America than just transgender women of color, undocumented transgender immigrants just existing and being visible and organizing? This is pictures of transgender detainees in the Santa Ana jail, because the jail licenses.
Sorry, Carmina, could you stand in front of the mic? The people in the lobby can't hear you.
Okay. Oh my God, nobody heard what I said earlier.
No, people here, but not in the lobby.
Okay, so these are transgender detainees in Santa Ana in the jail. The jail licenses beds out to ICE, and there's just been incredibly a lot of organizing by youth against that, and they just did so much organizing over the past 2 years that ICE announced that it was ending its contract in Santa Ana and would no longer have a presence in the jail. So look at this sign, that says "End Trans Detention." These are folks from the Familia Trans Queer Liberation Network. And I'm sorry if I messed that up, they're good friends of mine. They had hunger strikes, and they were leading protests to get ICE out of Santa Ana. This is an activist who put chains around himself, a trans youth from Peru who protested ICE being in Santa Ana. This is Jennifer Gutierrez, and the slogan of Familia is, in Spanish, "My existence is my resistance." And that's Jennifer protesting. More pictures: liberation, not deportation. This is I took this photo. This is a press conference held by transgender activists and sex workers protesting LAPD sweeps that they knew were taking place, that they felt were specifically targeting transgender sex workers, because the LAPD went to transgender service providers and said, "We're gonna have a sweep. Could you appear here after we do these arrests to provide services to transgender people?" Transgender people said, "We don't need to be arrested to get services. And the signs say,
jobs equals life, jails equals death. And they had this amazing press conference just in LA. That's Bambi Salcedo, president of the Trans Latina Coalition. This is a die-in that trans and LGBT activists had at Pride last year to draw attention to the murders of transgender women that they felt also wasn't being talked about enough by LGBT media, and just, they did this at Pride. And this is just an example of transgender and queer people being very intersectional. They are carrying coffins that say Black Lives Matter. So that has been very inspirational to me. Thank you.
Radical hope. That's kind of all that Native people have had for, let's be really honest, for like the last 500 years. And so a lot of the work that we do in the Red Nation is we build on traditions of resistance, because those traditions, a lot of people, when they think about Native folks, they think about us as sort of like cultural practitioners or more spiritual people, which is very true, but we're also incredibly radical. We have a long histories. This is actually one of the fundamental aspects of the history of Native American studies, which goes back into the late part of the 19th century. And so this history of resistance is something that we very much live and embody, that has been gifted to us by those who came before us. It's something that I've written about in my dissertation, specifically related to Navajo people. And so the fact that resistance actually makes history, if I'm a historian, right? And so I look at history and I understand how is it when Navajo people, I wrote about this in my dissertation, organize around something, whether it's resisting Peabody coal mine operations up on Black Mesa, which is a very important struggle in the entire history of American social movements. If folks know about that, not just Native social movements or the movements of my people, but how that resistance reverberates and continues on into the present moment. And I know a lot of the people who engage in that resistance, and so it's a generational thing that gives me a great deal of hope. Simon Ortiz, who's actually going to be at the Hammer Museum next month as part of the Jimmy Durham exhibit, he's an Acoma Pueblo revolutionary, been around for a long time, award-winning poet as well as writer. He gave the keynote presentation at the American Indian Studies Association conference that was held at UNM, the University of New Mexico, last month. And he sang this song, and the refrain of the song, I want to read it, I wrote it on Facebook, so I just brought it up from Facebook. But the song goes, "The land will endure, we shall have victory, our people shall go on." See, I'm gonna cry. We shall have victory. And so the reason why that's such an important thing and why it causes me to cry is because we will have victory. And having that hope is the most important thing that keeps me going in the work that I do, because the people who came before me had that hope, and it's a tradition that's as essential to the radical resistance of Native people as it is, some sort of pie in the sky kind of thing, and the way that people talk about it. And one more comment, because my time is going to be up. And this is something that Amina brought up before, this idea of hope is also part of the way that we engage in our practice of resistance. It's not just about resistance, but it's imagining a future, right? Resistance is very future-oriented, and indigenous resistance especially is very future-oriented. It's imagining a future that's not premised on racialized violence. I know what that future looks like in my mind, because actually a great deal of that form of sort of political governance and sort of the governance of self was happening up at Standing Rock in those camps. I'm sure some of you guys actually went up to Standing Rock. That movement was very complex and very messy, but there was a way that people were living together and with our non-human relatives, which are the land and the water and spirits, that was not premised on the racialized violence that underwrites sort of the normative conception of US nationalism, ideas of belonging and citizenship. And so how is it that we resist the violence that we're always being subjected to, but then how is it that we imagine and live otherwise, to borrow from Candace Chu's incredible book? And so I'll just stop there since I'm out of time.
So what really gives me radical hope is something that I love to do when I'm building relationships is learning more about a person, and storytelling is a way to really bridge a lot of gap and build honest, trustable relationships. And specifically, I've been doing a lot of immigration work, specifically for the last, I want to say, 9 years. And I have met so many amazing people in my life. And a lot of these people have gone through so much to be able to come here, to be able to live the life that they've always wanted. But yet they are also in constant shroud of just danger and just the white the white supremacy that is so prevalent in this country. And then another thing is I have the best niece and nephew. So the next generation is definitely what gives me radical hope of specifically that I can learn and being able to instill it onto them. And as I finish this water bottle, I'm thinking of recycling it next. And I'm from Portland, Oregon. I grew up there for 15 years, and LA does not really recycle. I don't know if I'm generalizing right now, but it's also how do I make it so that this planet and this everyone can thrive, and that we are not here just for ourselves, but we are here for the next generation and so on. And also just learning and growing and meeting new people and understanding their fight and understanding what gives them hope as well too gives me hope. And I will stop there.
So I share a lot of what you all mentioned. To answer this question, let me first offer that when we work in intersectional spaces that cross cultures and languages and experiences, we try and find a shared language. So the first part of my answer is going to use that shared language. But I think what's also equally important is to bring our own experiences and unique language and unique way of looking at the world to these conversations. So that will be the second part, if that's all right with everyone. So what gives me hope is, for example, the day after the election, I actually took my then 6-year-old daughter and my 5-year-old son into the election booth with me on election day. I always take them to the polls with me. And my daughter was so upset that I was voting for a third-party candidate and I wasn't voting for Hillary Clinton. She started crying. She's so mad. No, Mama, Hillary needs to win. Clinton's got to win. So like many parents or grandparents or people with nieces and nephews wake up the next morning, how do I explain what had just happened last night? So at breakfast I say, Trump won, Clinton lost. And the first thing she says to me is, Mommy, do we have to leave? And I say, no, baby, we're going to fight for our home. We're staying here, and we're going to fight for our home. Many conversations later, because of all the hours that have been required of the advocates and the people in the movement, many times I say to my baby girl, I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm not here as much. She's like, Mommy, I understand you're fighting Trump. You're fighting Trump. And whereas before, Riley, my daughter, knew me as a liar, right? I'm like, what do you mean by that? She says, Mama, you're a protester. Look, she knows me as a protester now. Like, that's my official job description. So that's what gives me hope, is that the resistance will live on. For as long as I can keep it up, I will keep it up. But in 10, 15 years, she's going to be there, along with my son and others. And they will carry on, not for us, but they will carry on for themselves and for those shared vision we're all creating. The second part of my answer, offering my own language, is I'm obviously a person of faith. And oftentimes in these spaces, we have to leave stuff at the door. And I don't think that's fair. So I'm going to offer that I do this work because of my faith, right? It's not tangential. It's what brings me to this work. And so hope is less of a word I use or like how I think of what I'm doing, and more of I think of the word of promise. I think of divine justice and ultimate justice, and I have faith and confidence and knowledge that will happen. We have similar language about a victory, that victory is promised to us and is assured to us. And we also have a language that with hardship comes ease. Verily, with hardship comes ease. So I know that as much as we struggle, things will get easier. not in the material sense, but things will get easier for our collective people. And that's how I bring my faith and what I know to be promise to this, and that collectively keeps me going. Thank you.
All right, so we can take about 15 minutes for questions. And so I want to open it up to the audience. Let's see who here has questions. Okay, we have at least one. So let's start there. We'll take a couple of questions.
So I want to respond to this idea of radical hope. And I mean, I know it lends itself to the idea of self-care and self-love and all of that. Pero as a Black woman, like activist, artist, like all those things, and like all of us, I assume that space of like fighters and things like that. But I think it goes in line with a narrative of this progressive linear idea of time. And I think it also aligns itself with ideas of struggle as redemptive and forgiveness as absolution, which personally I feel are ideas that are tools of the colonizer in order to oppress us. And so I wanted to because there's so much that people who fighting or no internalize, and they can't go past this time because we think of the future. But the only thing we all know as humans is that it's not guaranteed. And so how do we, as whatever we are, respond to that when there is a reality that, and I don't want to say revenge, but there is a narrative of resistance. There's another layer of resistance, and since this is about resistance, I think there's another layer of resistance, a resistance of those ideas that can be explored, and I wanted to know what feelings of those are, because not everybody has the future.
Okay, so we'll take a couple more questions.
You began this asking if this is a continuation or something new, and I think many of you spoke to the new and intensifying horrors that are going on, but this is not just a collection of intensifying horrors. This is something that has its own momentum. It is fascism. It is good to hear people speak the word that it is fascism, that it has its own momentum. And so my question and my statement and my question is, brother and sisters, time is short. Right now, the Pence regime, the Trump-Pence machine, has not consolidated. You know, they're having troubles. We have a short time to drive them out. So my question for you all is, where are you going? Is this aimed at building strength through resistance to drive these guys out in the next 2 to 3 months to pull people into the streets? Or is it aimed at enduring when we know that the logic and momentum is to overthrow laws, to rule by force? And so there's the question.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I want to preface this with a couple of different tidbits. I recently read that Trump over the last year if he paid for all of the press that he got, it would amount to around a little over $800 million of revenue. And to put this in perspective, the next 2 to 1,000 most popular people on the planet got a total of $770 million dollars in press generated for them, good or bad. But there's this recycling of once one news outlet picks up on a story, all of the other news outlets pick up on the same story. And I recently had a conversation with one of my close friends on lethargy and being oversaturated with all of this information. He brought up that he frequents Reddit, and in the months before the election, he would see all of this information on Trump being reported, and it would cycle through like on a daily news stream, and it would like go like make its way to the bottom. But as soon as one thing on Hillary was reported, it would stay at the top for weeks. So the
So your question is regarding the news cycle and the
well, my question
bias
is
or-
regarding like implications of this and our like lethargy. How do we like combat
Media
that and
fatigue.
instill like and continue to have advocacy and continue to make people care about advocacy when they just get tired?
Great, thank you. And one last question.
Yeah, so my name is Felina. I am an undergraduate student at ASU, so I did travel quite a bit. But
Well, thank you for coming out here.
I am here to ask you as an activist. I've been an organizer with the 5 for 15 movement in Arizona, and I work with Puente Human Rights Movement because of the ICE raids that have been continuously happening in Arizona. But the biggest problem we face is that Arizona has historically always been a very red state. So what is your advice to organizers in Arizona that are continuously fighting for our immigrants, for our refugees? What approach should we take, especially since we have such a historically red state and we don't have some of the laws in place that would protect us as organizers? Like we recently had a bill in our legislature that tried to criminalize protesting. And then the other thing is, for those of you that are lawyers, how do you balance being an activist, being an organizer, and also like studying the law and being an attorney?
Great, thank you. All right. So who would like to address any of these questions first?
I have thoughts on all of them. So
Please. Please.
You want to try and keep carrying? Just do this when you want me to stop.
It's okay at this point.
So in terms of the linearity question and that oversimplification of that common question, but there's that famous Martin Luther King Jr. quote that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It's a beautiful quote. I love it, but I have a really hard time with that because how long? Like, does it bend like this? Does it bend like this? Like, where are we on that arc? And I don't always feel that it's true. So I don't mean to take issue with Mr. King, or Dr. King, but I do feel like justice is more of a locomotive, right? It keeps pounding forward. We don't control it. We don't steer it, but it is there and it is pounding forward at its own pace. And our role is to hammer and chisel and pin, and lay the tracks for it. And that's how I view it. And so for me, when I'm doing this work, I don't look to the end goal, the end destination. I just know that there's this train going forward with or without me, and am I going to help with it? Whether, with respect to fascism and whether we're trying to throw it out, I would again just say, like, we're trying to build the world that we're looking for. And this isn't about Trump. Like, as has been said, he's the natural outcome of these systems. We take him out, we cut off that head, 3 more will rise, right? So I do think this is about taking down the systems and not toning down the rhetoric. With respect to media fatigue, I would just offer some basic tools. When you get that rumbling in your gut, hopefully, and it all goes in waves with all of us, look at your sphere of influence, your circle of influence. It's different for everyone. Literally map out that sphere of influence, do a landscape map, power map. These are all terms we use in organizing, but each individual can do this. What are the actors that you can influence and how and who influences you? And then kind of take that issue by issue by issue. As you can see, we have like 6 different causes. I don't do everything for each of these causes, and I am not up to speed with everything that everyone's working on, but I know what my sphere of influence is, and I funnel like my information reception through that sphere. And kind of everything else is not irrelevant, but I just I know it reflects and will bounce to one of the other issues. And with respect to this historically red state in Arizona, I would just offer that I think there are so many potential allies in Arizona that are just not politically educated about what's going on. And I feel like the best thing in a red state, and this comes from mainly me having a lot of family in Arizona and friends, and is that if people understand this and are able to start ridding of their material comforts, I think more people will show up to the cause. So I would start, that should be one of the starting points, I think, is to politically educate potential ally groups.
And who would like to go next?
I know they're really intelligent
We're
questions.
thinking deeply about the questions. I want to respond to the last question. I think about just how, if we're in a blue state, how do we support folks in states where people are really targeted and impacted in red states? I mean, that's a question that comes up all the time in LGBT activism. Like, just for example, in response to recently, like Trump's withdrawal of Obama's guidance about the protection of transgender students has no impact at all on students in California, because we have such strong protections. I say that legally, but at the same time, it still does embolden bullies, so it will have an impact just socially, and but legally, it doesn't have an impact. So, you know, we get that question too from folks in other states, like what should we do? So I think like what I've heard recently is that people in blue states should really like use, or activists should use online platforms more in whatever way we can, and to support the organizing efforts and strategies of people in red states. I mean, of course, donating money, there's groups just in the South, groups in red states that are just deeply underfunded that need support. There's Southerners on a New Ground, which is a group, you know, that advocates for transgender people in the South. You know, we have to have conversations with people in the South and people in these states to really, you know, we can't just like, yeah, we can't leave them to do all the work and not support them somehow. So I'd love to hear from you, actually, if you have any suggestions about what could be helpful other than like online platforms, sending resources, sending money, you know, offering up space if folks come to our state to like have a conference or something, or meetings. I mean, I've heard too that people in those states want to know how to gain protections that we have in our state. Like they would like that knowledge, and us to share those strategies with them. So yeah, that's an important question.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else, or any other thoughts also that you feel that you didn't get a chance to get to, or question you had for another panelist as well?
Just one of the quick things, again, on that issue is, y'all ready to start talking about organizing and direct action? So we've been, a lot of the folks and have been discussing, you know, geography, what is our expanse, again, where are we trying to influence, and we've been talking a lot about neighboring states. And so if you are from a neighboring state and you want LA or greater LA to show up, just let us know. If you want us to bring a bus out and help you with that political education, block by block organizing, whatever it is, like just let us know. It's not going to be that easy, like, you know, for us to show up, but I mean, those are definitely conversations that we've been thinking about. There is bandwidth, there's funding, there's a lot of considerations, but it's definitely not off the table. I mean, we're still trying to figure out how to get down to Orange County, but Orange County, Arizona, I mean, they're kind of politically the same in a lot of ways. So.
I think I can answer the where are you going? And it's not me that's going somewhere. It's where I'm talking with the community. I'm seeing what is firsthand of the issues and the problems that the community is seeing, and looking at ways of how to strategize with the community as well too, to talk about what are avenues, what are ways, and what are the opportunity that I can give them as an organizer, and also using my relationships as well too, figuring out how to guide specific folks into the right direction. And then also another thing that I do is I don't really answer questions or try to give advice that I don't really know the answers to, and these are hard questions, so I don't want to do like a disservice and talk about the wrong thing. And then specifically what's going on in Arizona, I know voter suppression is a real thing in this nation, and a lot of voter rights are marginalizing specific communities and being able to take away their specific rights. And it's also that we have to figure out specifically, we have to figure out, like, I'm gonna say this, so white people, get your cousins. Like, talk to your community. This is a fight that we've known that has been going on for a really long time, and how a lot of the marginalized community in Arizona are trying to do everything, but they're always 2 steps behind. And please talk to your community. Please educate your cousins, your friends, your sister, your neighbor, all that you can, or the capacity that you have.
So for me, the questions that were posed, specifically the second question and the fourth question, really what it reminds me of is just the fact that these issues are not new, as was previously mentioned, and the importance of not just getting allies and people to help in the organizing work, but also bringing back folks who were once part of these movements, who once were part of the organizing before Obama, to be able to partake, and for us to be able to learn from each other of what worked and what didn't work. And I think that's very prevalent because, yeah, we're talking about California. We're saying that, if DACA were to be taken away, or if certain things were to go a certain way, the students would still have access to financial aid, to in-state tuition. But that wasn't the reality. There was a point in time where California, as you all know, had passed Proposition 187, which would have essentially kicked me out of elementary school at that time, and would have had major consequences to access to health care and other benefits. And so it took a long time to get to where we are now, and I think now more than ever it's important for folks who joined the movement more recently to go back and to try to encourage those who were part of the movement and part of these campaigns in the past to re-engage and to re-participate so we can learn from each other.
Yeah, the reason why I've been really silent, I really appreciate the answers that y'all have given, is because I really don't know how to answer these questions. I think I actually didn't entirely understand the first question, so that's part of the issues, and I apologize. If you want to talk to me afterward, I would really welcome that opportunity. This question about where are we going in terms of fascism and driving out Trump and Pence, that's not everybody's agenda or level of preparation, I think, in the movement. When I was talking earlier about galvanizing the left and empowering the left in a really radical intersectional way, because it's not right now, it's not super radical and intersectional, just from my own experience working within it as a Native woman doing organizing around Indigenous issues. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do amongst our own circles and working across difference and building coalition to have some sort of galvanized left that is as empowered and really effective, strategically effective against the alt-right and sort of these more extreme forms of right politics. And so my ultimate vision is that, we decolonize what we now know as the United States. That's a really radical thing to say, but it's kind of like a normal thing for Native people to think about and to say. And so if that means enduring, I'm not really sure if those are the right terms that we would put those in terms of the kind of organizing that we do. Combating fatigue and continuing to move on with the advocacy. My partner, he's Lakota, he's been very involved in the No DAPL struggle up at Standing Rock because those are his relatives. He said something really poignant a few days ago that I think helps to answer this question. He said, even though we're facing an intensification of horrors, and it's been very difficult, emotionally and spiritually, metaphysically for me. I've been very tired, I've been crying a lot, I've been very angry. I'm kind of like those things all the time anyway, but it's been much more, it's been like a month of feeling like being punched in the face, right? Repeatedly over, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who has felt this way. He's like, so, and this is also coming off of the fact that Trump allowed the Dakota Access Pipeline to go through, right? Earlier in February, this is coming off of all of the forced evictions, highly militarized forced evictions that have happened within the last handful of days up at camp. This is coming after Obama denied clemency to Leonard Peltier. So it's a contradiction, the moment for Native people right now, because he said, even though it's horrible and there's such intense fatigue because there's so many people who mobilized around the Standing Rock issue, and there's a lot of grief. There's a lot of grief, and there's a hell of a lot of like literal trauma. I mean, people being beaten by the cops in that movement, hundreds of people from our communities who are up on the front lines. We're in kind of a low point right now, but like we can taste freedom. It's like such a strange contradiction. It's it's extreme contradiction. I think particularly that Native people are in, and that Standing Rock. You know, Amina said this really beautifully when you told the story about your daughter. You know, there were thousands of young Native people who were up at Standing Rock who were living in that community and were experiencing for the first time ever, I never got to experience this in my generation, what freedom actually felt like, what it meant to just exist without mediation from the state, without mediation from these sort of violent normativities, right, and restrictions and limitations that are always placed on our lives. And so there is this beautiful, strong sense. It's not a dream and it's not even a hope. It's like a reality of freedom that Native people have in this moment at the same time that we're really sad and we're really angry and we're fucking scared, right? And so that being the case, what keeps me going is pushing one of those forward, right? And overcoming the fear. I'm a leader, I'm a cheerleader, I'm a mentor. And so for me, it's sheer willpower. And also understanding where my place within the long history and the long struggle of resistance also helps me to continue moving forward, despite all odds and despite what may be catastrophic consequences. I absolutely will not stop engaging in the work, and I can tell that the people on the panel feel the same way. And that comes directly from that spirit on the front lines in Standing Rock. What was most profound, one of the most profound things about that is I was seeing everyday people rise up and refusing to back down. And that hasn't gone away. We may need to sleep for a while, but it's gonna keep happening in waves, and it's not just Native people, right? It's people, it's millions of people. And that is a historic thing that has yet to unfold, and we have yet to see where that's actually gonna lead, but we have to cultivate it, and we have to be the cheerleaders, and we have to help lead it and organize it. So I apologize if that wasn't as complete an answer, but.
Over here instead. So just a few quick thoughts before we end. First, before we do, just thank you again for our panelists for just sharing such beautiful insights. And I wanted to end on, go back for a second to that Junot Diaz piece that I had mentioned. I'd actually sent this to my students right after the election and shared this with them when I was at a loss for words, and I wanted to share this with you now. He wrote, "For those of us who have been in the fight, the prospect of more fighting after so cruel a setback will seem impossible. At moments like these, it is easy for even a Matatana to feel that she can't go on. But I believe that once the shock settles, faith and energy will return. Because let's be real, we always knew that shit wasn't going to be easy. Colonial power, patriarchal power, capitalist power must always and everywhere be battled because they never ever quit. We have to keep fighting because otherwise there will be no future. All will be consumed. Those of us who have ancestors who are owned and bred like animals know that future all too well because it is in part our past. And we know that by fighting against all odds, we who had nothing, not even our real names, transformed the universe. Our ancestors did this with very little, and we who have more must do the same. This is the joyous destiny of our people, to bury the arc of the moral universe so deep in justice that it will never be undone." And I know that it ends on, and I actually agree with that critique regarding the moral arc, but I want to share this because my mantra is lifted from this for at least the foreseeable future, and you're free to steal this mantra, which I'm stealing from Junot Diaz, is that we always knew this shit wasn't going to be easy. But I'm really honored to be fighting the shit alongside of all of the panelists here and all of you.